Hello, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming and joining us here this evening for our discussion with regards to resilience or reaction, so crisis management as a whole. I am joined here in our wonderful studio this evening by Mr. Courtney and Mr. Gareth Byatt. Now, Carl, despite his youthful looks, has almost 40 years' experience working with issues and crises as a whole. His nickname may be Crisis Carl, but we're assured that he isn't the one that actually creates the crises. Yes? Try not to. Excellent. So Carl's first experience with a crisis was with the Heinz baby food crisis back in 1986. Yep. And then more recently, things like the Securitas heist in 2006, and many in between and since then as well. Carl is now the main man behind Hard Rain, which is a fantastic organisation that deals with issues and crises, working most usually at the very top end of organisations, and helping people out of those holes when they find themselves in them. An avid cook, or should I say chef? No, Carl also spends much of his time on a bicycle as and when he can get on it. So round of applause, please, for Carl. Thank you very much. Yay. And Gareth. Gareth is also a cyclist of a slightly different genre. So actually a professional cyclist to a certain degree, or a competitive cyclist.
Competitive, let's say. I know a few pro riders. I've ridden with some of the winners of the Tour de France.
Oh, so just dropping that in there. Thank you very much, Gareth.
Where are you on drugs?
Let's move on from that. You should be doing the interview, Carl. That'd be great. Okay. When he's not on his bicycle, Gareth most recently was the group risk manager and then the head of risk management of Asia for Lend-Lease. He then set up his own organisation called Risk Insight, which is based in Australia. When he's not being the principal consultant for Risk Insight, he is also the visiting lecturer at the University of New South Wales in Sydney and a global ambassador for the Institute of Risk Management for Australia and Asia. And he's also the director for Satarla in Australia. So round of applause, please, for Gareth. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, so gentlemen, are you ready for the quick fire round? Wow. We should have had a buzzer. That'd be great. So, Carl, maybe if I can come to you first. Could you please, in your own words, define what is a crisis and maybe give an example of one?
Well, a crisis is something that can happen to any organisation, and crisis management is really creating a culture within that organisation whereby whatever happens, that they're going to be in a position to be able to respond to it. So, now, that crisis can come out of something that's been happening over a number of years, what we call a smouldering crisis, something that's been coming up bit by bit by bit, or it can be a major event. Typically in the transportation business, that might be an air crash or a coach crash or anything like that. So it can happen suddenly or it can happen slowly, but the characteristic of it is that the organisation gets bent out of shape and comes under incredible scrutiny for how the events leading up to what has happened, whether that is permissive behaviour within an organisation or the event itself of a crash. Why did it happen? And that kind of scrutiny needs to be prepared for by organisations, and we holistically call that crisis management.
Okay, fantastic. Gareth, anything to add?
I think that's a very good description of it all. And maybe one other thing that I'll just build upon, if I may, Carl, is that you're talking about they get bent out of shape, and some of the words from one of the standards in crisis management, which is quite good. We'll touch upon this piece a little bit later as well. British Standard 11200. They define a crisis as an abnormal and unstable condition that threatens an organisation's strategic objectives, its reputation, or its viability. And I was just wondering what you think about the use. They deliberately use this term condition.
Yeah, they do. But I think it's largely about reputation, because crisis management is basically broken down, as we like to think of it, as two things: is how the organisation responds, what it does when something's gone wrong, and then it's how it communicates what it does. So you've got these two separate things here, and one without the other doesn't work. You can be the best communicator in the world, but if you've not put the right actions in place, if you don't respond appropriately, expediently, if you don't do what's demanded of you by modern day living, which is social media, all your stakeholders. If you don't do that, you're going to fail, even if you communicate brilliantly, and vice versa. You can put everything in place and be highly competent and really caring and considering, and you then fail to communicate it, you've also failed. So it's the bringing together of these two things, and to do that requires a change in culture for organisations that don't have it, or an improving of the culture for those that do. And the condition, I think, is something that we do refer to, and it's not the status quo. So, how you respond to it, the level-headedness that you bring to it, the practice that you bring to it, is kind of what we try to set the bar for organisations.
Right, so we talked a lot about communicating. So you have crisis communication. How does crisis management, crisis communication, business continuity management, emergency response, how do they differ, or how do they come together? Is it all part of the same thing? Maybe if I come to Gareth first.
That's a good question, and it's something that I get asked quite a lot by different organisations, and it's something that a lot of us in this type of practice do think about, isn't it? And I think the way to look at these things is to make sure that they're integrated. So, and of course, as part of that, you want to be clear on what do they actually mean. So what is the difference between emergency response, crisis management, business continuity? Clarify that as clearly as you can. Diagrams can often help in these kind of ways. And in the integrated nature of these things, I also want to be able to stress that up the front, you really want to have good risk management to be managing the risks so that those emergencies and those crises and those disruption events that you have with business continuity, that they don't occur. Yes, be prepared, because things can and do happen. And at the end of it, make sure that you're actually learning lessons properly as well. And not just doing it, say, a month after a team has closed down or something like that, but to actually genuinely learn these lessons and actually instill them back into the organisation. Anything else, Carl?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the thing is that the main thing that organisations need to do is learn from them. I mean, I see a sort of collective sigh of relief when crises ends, and people don't realise that crises often come along like buses. The best example I can give, I'll perhaps talk more about it later, was Securitas, the world's largest security company. And in 2006, my first weekend in April, was dealing with a heist in Stockholm when £50,000 worth of currency was stolen by an armed gang. And, come Tuesday, we're coming down from that. On Wednesday was the heist at Tonbridge in Kent when £53 million was stolen. And that took my life over pretty much for a week, sitting on the police gold group. Very interesting experiencing how in a major event you can actually set a strategy, which is something perhaps we could talk about, which I think is really interesting. And then on Friday they had another £12 million stolen in Warrington in Lancashire. So over 100 million was stolen in a week, and there was 3 major events. Now, if I tell you in the United Kingdom alone, there's something like 1,200 cash-in-transit thefts a year, you think that's quite a lot. Well, it is. In fact, just interesting, in America, the number is 0. And that will be because they carry guns. But anyway, 1,200 a year is quite a lot, and there's only 3 players, but to lose 100 million in a week by anyone's standards is... So basically, the kind of law is you have to remember that just because the event is over doesn't mean there's another one coming your way anytime soon.
And just one point as well, Carl, I was just thinking about as you talked about that. We're talking about a lot of these events that they involve people. There's obviously a lot of emotion to these things, but also increasingly you have things like the cyber attacks. And a few years ago, some people will remember the NotPetya one, and some organisations were severely out of pocket on those kind of situations as well. So a crisis can take many forms, can't it? And everyone is unique.
Yeah, that's quite right. And something that interests me about cybercrime particularly is that organisations quite understandably reluctant sometimes to admit that it's happened, because there's a systemic failure in the organisation, however you judge it. I've come to organisations that I've actually found out once I've signed the NDAs that have paid out ransom amounts over a period of time Well, of course they keep coming back. I mean, if they're not going to tell anyone about it and just keep writing checks, it's going to keep happening. So, that's not to ridicule them, but, so just because you have a crisis and just because something goes wrong, you get disruption, doesn't mean that necessarily it's in the public domain. But you still have to act. So what you do is still important, even if communication actually doesn't come into it.
And just tying on to that point as well, if I may, Sarah, just in terms of the communication and the cyber side of things, data privacy is a key thing, and we all know about various different types of data hacking that has taken place and continues to take place. And there are some pretty stiff fines in place nowadays through things like the GDPR. If you do not notify once you know about it, within 72 hours, for example, you've got a maximum 4% revenue fine or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. So it's big money we're talking about here too.
I'll just quick. Sorry, I know we're talking a bit too much, but I interviewed a cyber expert recently because as a main attraction in London that I look after had a very serious hack. 20,000 customers, it was to do with kids, and the email was seized and some pornographic material was sent out. It was all very, very difficult. And I was interviewing the cyber expert that fixed the problem, closed the door, if you like. Chief exec and I asked this expert about, why do they do it? Because there's no money gains. And he just said, because they can. It's fun. They're bored people. And so this sort of brings a new level to crisis, really, when it's not just material gain or it's not just poor engineering or act of God. It's people just being bored. Want to create disruption for fun. It's terribly difficult.
So we've spoken about, examples of a crisis that might emanate from the world of cybercrime or from people going and stealing cold hard cash. Crises can also come from a big piece of infrastructure failing, for example. So when you go into the world of health and safety, etc. When the rubber hits the road, who should actually own that crisis? Where should the crisis management plan or system, who should actually own that within a business, or how does that cascade through the organization?
Well, any competent organisation should have a proper trained crisis management team in place that should go through rigorous and training year in, year out to make sure that it's ready to rock and roll at any given time. I mean, this business that there used to be, 10, 15 years ago, that you could have a crisis manual and somehow you could dust it down when something goes wrong is completely wrong now. So you need a crisis team trained, but I think the most important thing of all is the culture within the organisation to accept that things might go wrong and do go wrong. And that starts, dare I say it, with risk management, assessing what could possibly go wrong. Good risk management, as we know, will cut down the incidence of crisis, but then events still do occur. So that team should be trained and should be known within the business. Everyone within an organisation, from the night watchman to a receptionist, should know what to do if something happens from left field. And the cascading of that information is critically important. Everyone needs to understand that. And when the team get that information, they need to be able to respond to it tout suite, and they need to be structured accordingly that their desks can be cleared so they can deal with the crisis, and that's its number one priority. And if they fail on any of those points, they will fail overall.
Yeah, just to back up on those points, fully agree with all of those points, Carl. And I'm thinking also that when it works well, the line of communication from the people who should know, everyone in an organisation, and dare I say it, sometimes external communities as well, the line of communication to the people to be able to enact that team needs to be short, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So, you can't have 5 levels to get to and someone's not around and you wait and things like that. So it's got to be something that can take place quickly because that affects your ability to be able to respond and then to look at the recovery side of things. And just on the team as well, the importance of having strength in depth and delegates. And when I say delegates, I'm really talking about people that they can step in, and they may well do, because these are high-pressure situations, and people sometimes take the hero mentality in this type of situation, but they get very tired, and having delegates who are properly skilled and trained, who can properly help, and maybe also take over the reins for a period of time, those kind of things can, I think, really make a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, and the war room, effectively, they still exist, is all designed to facilitate that. So the recording of information, I mean, a core member of any crisis management team has got to be, someone who records everything that comes in, because it gets forgotten. So it needs to be lists on the wall about what happened at what time. The most important thing the crisis team does, in a way, when a crisis crosses its path, is it needs to launch an investigation, because the investigation is every organisation's best friend. So when it comes to communication, the immediate point of view, when the world wants to know answers to questions that you don't know the answer to and are asking you them, you're able to stand behind the fact that you've launched an investigation and that you're doing your utmost to ensure that you're going to get the information that everyone wants. And when that investigation is complete, you'll tell them. So it affords you some protection while it's going on. So the team needs to thoroughly investigate. You can't sit back and rely on the emergency services, on the coroner, or whoever else might be involved. It's your responsibility to get to the bottom of this, and your team should all have bespoke and clearly understood functions, technical, sales, if you like, customer relations, production, whatever the business is. It needs to have experts and deputies, as you rightly point out, within that. And of course, you need to remember, you make a very good point, Gareth, that the team might be working on this for months and years to come. Grenfell Tower, crisis that I've worked on, have gone on for weeks and months, and the attrition on and the sheer pressure of what's going on and being at the centre of attention is incredibly debilitating. So you've got to be in it for the long haul too. It's not a sprint.
The toll it takes, it can be heavy, and also on part of that as well, you need to remember that the team, the crisis management team, as well as, of course, people who are affected, they need to have the right kind of support behind, well-being type of support. That needs to be readily available. Just one point about the teams as well, is that what I've found, whether in all different types of teams, the value of administrators, you were talking there about being able to capture things and the like, but to be able to look after things that normally you'd consider menial, but they're things like making sure you've got good enough quality food, that there's a certain agenda and diary of things. Take that pressure away from the actual team, because they'll grab the quickest thing they can, which over a period of time it's not actually going to be good for them, and they've got enough stress as it is to deal with. So that's just a small point, but it can be quite a valuable one.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about the makeup of the team as well. I think it's terribly important, and we always do this when we train crisis management teams, that it shouldn't be the most senior person who's necessarily the crisis team leader. Because what you get in strong and powerful corporations is the A-lister at the top, the person who calls the shots and makes the decisions. Well, that actually makes a crisis team almost redundant, because they just become servants of the one person who's making decisions. A good crisis team should have the freedom to interrogate one another, to push one another. Are you absolutely sure of your information? And it's very hard to do that if you've got someone who's basically got your career in their hands. You actually get a very strong leader, and then a series of yes men and women, and that will never work. So part of the training is to realise there's a kind of democracy in a crisis management team. Everyone's voice should be heard, and within the crisis room you can challenge one another as hard and as brutally as you want. And when you leave that room, you've got to have a consensus, and you portray a consistent picture to the outside world, whether that's internally or externally. Mm-hmm. So what goes on in the room stays in the room.
Mm-hmm. And just lastly, the roles and responsibilities that people have, I think that backs that up, doesn't it? And that's an example of where, sure, you can put that into a plan, but if you don't actually really live the plan as part of a culture, then you'll default to your normal position.
Yeah, there's no trust.
There's no trust, and it just won't work.
So just to try and summarise what we've just been hearing then, it's a case of the person that's in charge won't necessarily be the CEO, and actually probably shouldn't be, especially perhaps if it's that crisis that's going to go on for a while, but also in terms of imbibing that trust within the team as a whole, but also within the team actually having that, or within the organisation, having that depth of capability, so you can pull the right team of people together with the right types of expertise.
And externally as well, Sarah.
Yeah, so actually being able to, knowing who to call at that moment, through to having the right plan or the right strategy, being trained in how to actually speak to a camera and communicate succinctly what is going on and getting the right message out there as a whole. And then finally, remembering that we're all human beings. And so from a welfare perspective, we can't sit there for 24/7 and actually try and solve this thing. We do need to eat, we do need to sleep and look after one another as well. Would that be accurate? Ish.
Yes, very good.
Excellent. So I think, I mean, with regards to this, have you got any examples of where you've actually seen a crisis being managed well?
Well, I always say that doctors bury their mistakes, and we all know great stories about crisis that has failed. They're much more interesting in a way, and everyone thinks I would never have done that. There's much fewer good stories, I think. So obviously there are some, so the big transportation companies, the airlines, by and large, are pretty good, but we can all think of exceptions where they're not. You tend not to notice the good ones. You just tend not to notice. So I think they are few and far between. But, my goodness me, when people look at case studies for crisis management, I always say to people in the training room and when I'm putting together teams for corporates is, what you've got to remember is two things. No two crises are ever the same. So when you look at one, that's fine, but they're always different, even if they materially look the same. And I think the other thing is that you can only imagine what it's like to be in the maelstrom of a crisis once you've actually done one. Because when a crisis is over, everyone knows the facts, but when you're in the middle of it, you don't. And one of the key things about a crisis team doing the investigation is that you should have 12 questions or 100 questions, because you are desperate for information to put together the puzzle that befronts you. So a good crisis management team will be working and firing on all cylinders, doing what it needs to do. Do you have some specifics that you could refer to, Gareth?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you were saying just there, because I would like to say that I can think of some good examples of how crises have been managed well. One that often comes to my mind. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and fly with Qantas quite a lot. And Qantas have I think, arguably enviable safety record. And on the 4th of November 2010, one of their A380s that was being piloted by Captain Richard de Crepinay was taking off from Changi Airport, and at about just under 3,000 feet or so, one of the engines literally blew up, shrapnel going everywhere. Now, I could talk about it for a long time, but I shan't on this occasion. What I can say was that the coordination of the Qantas teams in the plane, in the crisis centre, as we were talking about with the senior leader, Alan Joyce in this case, he was a spokesman and putting things into action because they had plans and they carried out training, they had strength and depth, they were and are a high reliability organisation. And if you look at, I mentioned it was in 2010, so that's almost 10 years ago now, but if you go onto the internet and do any research on this, you're going to find that it's about how things were managed well, and that's because it was. So if you just think sometimes, who knows whether an investor or various other parties want to, at some point in time, to do certain research about your organisation. Obviously, they're going to look on the internet. It's very easy to find these things nowadays. Certainly, in the case of Qantas with that crisis event, over 400 people in the plane, I hasten to add. It was a very good example of one that was managed well, putting into place the kind of things that I think it's fair to say we've talked about.
Brilliant. So on that then as well, are there any international standards or guidelines or frameworks or anything like that we can lean towards that give us an outline as to how we might want to put in place that strategy or that team to help us manage a crisis? Let's Gareth.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. There are some good standards out there. I mentioned one earlier, BS 11200, dates back to 2014, so it's not that old. And it's got some good elements to it. If you really pay attention and look at it, it talks about the importance of the team, how you manage the communications, all of the things that we've talked about. So that's BS 11200, the 2014 version. From an international standards organisation, ISO, obviously BSI, British Standards Institute, and ISO, they do link together as they do in other parts of the world. Currently, there's there's a lot around resilience in ISO. The 22300 family. So 22300 is the definitions. They just updated it. 301 is around business resilience and security. 317 is around business impact analysis. So a lot of business resilience, business continuity pieces there. Interestingly, they haven't got anything at the moment on crisis management. That's nothing specific. But I know that, I talk to people in this space, maybe you do too, Carl, that say that they're working to change that. And there are some good standards for sure on we touched upon emergency response or emergency preparedness and response, and there are some good standards there also from organisations like the World Bank and things. And some of the ethos that they provide and they contain, they are equally valid in many elements for crisis management as well. So I think it's something that the community is looking at. There are some good pieces out there. And there's scope for some more.
So with that then, should we be calling this business resilience, or is it crisis management, or what's the title above the door? Are they the same things, or are they different things?
I personally think the handles are less important. I think you need to look at it holistically, what the organisation needs, and that will partly come out of risk management. It will partly come out of the senior people. Asking the senior people what keeps them awake at night, what are the things that could go wrong in this organisation, this enterprise, and I think you can cover most things off within that, even if you can't assess the ramifications, the repercussions. You can identify the things, and I think people sometimes ask me, can I have a copy of a crisis management plan that I can copy for my organisation? Well, it's useless. If it's not bespoke, it's of no use to you at all. And a plan in itself, as I opened up by saying, in itself is a redundant document. It's all about how the senior people arrive at dealing with problems as and when they occur. And of course there should be a system in there. Of course everyone needs to be able to know what they do. But the point is, are they crisis ready? And if they're not in a good place, because crisis can strike at any time and does.
Yeah, I'm a strong advocate for that term, crisis ready, and the cultural side of things. I do think, as we talked about earlier, there is scope to be able to look at how some of the elements tie together in their entirety. If it's a business disruption, there may be slightly less of a crisis emphasis than other things that occur. I do find that there is space to, whether you call it resilience or something else, I'm similar to you, Carl. It's not so much about the actual name of what it's called. It's about the mindset, and it's about being ready and just stitching it into what you do as an organisation. That's where it can really work.
Okay, so it's about the mindset, it's about being crisis ready, but obviously it's all about doing the risk management up front to make sure we're minimising it. Yeah. Okay, so final question, gentlemen. Okay, so, and this is any final hints or tips beyond which, of course, you've already very carefully articulated. Is there anything else that you'd like to give us before we close?
Let me see. What have we covered so far?
Well,
let's have a quick recap.
I think it's terribly important that if you try and get this culture, that you keep it going. You've got to keep the plate spinning, without a doubt. I think that's terribly, terribly important. I think communicating to everyone so everyone knows that there's a plan. So it's not just a few people that know that. It's the whole enterprise and the whole organisation knows that when something goes wrong. In this day and age, I think it's very important that any organisation, particularly of any size, has social media monitoring. There was a time when perhaps we first got into crisis management when typically we would hear of an event from an MD or from a newspaper reporter or the night watchman, someone answering the phone. It could be any one of those very simple, crude, what now seem like crude channels. And now, 99% of the time, it comes via social media. So, the readiness is 24/7, and that has to be monitored. And people are constantly thrown off their guard when they realise that they're not the first to know. They can almost be the last to know. So, it's a constant job to make sure that you're ahead of the curve, because when something goes wrong, you want the maximum amount of time that you possibly can. And if you're already on the back foot, you're going to feel pressure right from the off.
Yeah. So you certainly stole my thunder there with the social media piece, but that's absolutely fine, Carl. I agree, and on the social media side of things, that's a point, brings me onto a point about the fact that there are some good tools, if you use them in the right way, that can help you to keep abreast of what's happening externally. So you can get some good monitoring tools in social media that can help you to be able to see what's happening. There are certain tools that you can use, but it's not just about technology, of course. It's about the team being there and ready to be able to do things properly. The
last simple one I'd throw out is a bit Mickey Mouse, but I'm amazed at how many organisations don't have a list of all the people that's important to them. You know, list of customers, contacts, media, trade associations, families, staff. You know, the list goes on and on. Once you start to do a list of who's important to any organisation, you realise you've got a big blooming list here. And actually, if it's not kept up to date, it's useless. But most organisations don't bother, and this is particularly true where organisations operate in silos. So sales look after customers, quality look after ingredients. You know, you can have it all there, and then when something goes wrong, you try and extract that information out of an organisation, and it's in password-protected files, and you're stymied. You know, so you need that stuff real quick.
And also just where your data is as well. You know, sometimes it can take you far longer than it should if you don't actually know where it is, or the people that know where it is, they're unavailable, uncontactable. So that piece is there. And I guess my final point is that scenario planning can be a really valuable part of crisis management because it helps you to think through some of what could happen, some of the worst case pieces. Oftentimes, when they initially kick off, not always, we underestimate how severe some of these things could be. So making sure you've got good scenario planning in place, I think, is really important.
And just on that point, it's a bit of a skill and to be able to put together a good simulation or scenario, and it's worth paying someone to come in, probably from the outside, to do it. My own shtick here. The example I give is of a food company that I did a few years ago, where we wrote a scenario that involved the loss of life of a member of the public in the end, and it was, it played out over a day, and it culminated in the loss of life. And someone on the main board couldn't do the interview with the sobbing, with the realization that it could happen. Well, if that can happen in a simulation, can you imagine what it's going to be like in real life?
Yeah. Actually, that's one final point I just want to re-emphasize. I know my final point, yes, the importance of well-considered, well-designed simulations that are fit for purpose for what you're doing, risk-informed as well.
Bespoke every time.
So thank you very, very much. Carl, Gareth, round of applause. Thank you.